On June 13, 1994, Edward J. Zakrzewski brutally murdered his wife, Sylvia, and their two young children, Edward Jr. and Anna, in a violent outburst of rage. The crime was as horrifying as it was senseless. Sylvia was struck multiple times with a crowbar, then strangled with a rope. His children, Edward Jr. and Anna, his own flesh and blood, were both attacked with a machete, resulting in severe head and neck injuries. Their bodies were found in a bathroom, stacked together in a haunting scene of brutality. What drove a father to commit such an unspeakable act? A crumbling marriage, a betrayal that led to an uncontrollable rage, and a deep desire to maintain control over his family. Edward Zakrzewski's actions shocked the community and shattered his family beyond repair. Edward Zakrzewski and his wife, Sylvia, had been married for more than a decade, but their relationship had been deteriorating for years. Their once stable life began to crumble under the weight of marital problems. By 1994, Sylvia had reached her breaking point. She wanted a divorce, and her intention was to take their children, Edward Jr. and Anna, with her. Zakrzewski was unable to cope with the idea of losing control over his family. He felt threatened and helpless. Sylvia's desire to leave him was too much for him to bear. His fragile ego and growing jealousy fueled a dangerous obsession. He had threatened to kill his family before if his wife ever tried to take the children away, and now that threat was becoming a reality. On the morning of June 9, 1994, Edward Jr. called his father at work, informing him of Sylvia's plans to divorce him. This phone call seemed to set him on a destructive path. That afternoon, Zakrzewski purchased a machete during his lunch break and made preparations for the murder. It was no longer just about the breakdown of his marriage. His need for control had transformed into a violent determination to eliminate any obstacle. The motive behind the murders became clear. Zakrzewski couldn't bear the thought of losing his family, especially not in the way that Sylvia had planned. His actions, fueled by his anger, jealousy, and mental distress, would lead to one of the most brutal family tragedies in the area's history. On June 13, 1994, the day that would forever change the lives of Edward Zakrzewski and his family, the tension between him and Sylvia reached its peak. After Sylvia's announcement that she was leaving him, Zakrzewski's emotions spiraled out of control. The plan was set into motion, and in the hours leading up to the murders, he was calm enough to complete his daily routine, working, attending a college course, and even purchasing a machete. Zakrzewski's mental state was clearly deteriorating, but his actions suggested a disturbing level of calculation and premeditation. He didn't act in a frenzied outburst. Instead, he meticulously planned the execution of his family's demise. Upon returning home ahead of his wife and children, Zakrzewski hid the machete in the bathroom, readying himself for what would be a horrifying and tragic series of events. Sylvia arrived home, unsuspecting of the violence that was about to unfold. First, he struck her with a crowbar, violently hitting her in the head. The force was enough to knock her unconscious, but not immediately fatal. He dragged her into the bedroom, where the brutality continued. He grabbed a rope and strangled her to death. His coldness was chilling. He wasn't just trying to kill her. He was making sure she suffered. Once Sylvia was dead, Zakrzewski moved on to his next victims, his children, Edward Jr. and Anna. He called Edward Jr. into the bathroom, under the pretense of getting him to brush his teeth. When Edward entered, he struck him multiple times with the machete, inflicting fatal injuries. Edward Jr. fought back, showing defensive wounds on his arms and wrists, but it was all in vain. The attack was brutal, and Zakrzewski seemed determined to end the life of his son without remorse. Next came Anna, the youngest of the victims. It's unclear whether Anna fully understood what was happening. Zakrzewski called her into the bathroom, possibly seeing her brother's lifeless body already sprawled out on the floor. In a horrifying and cold execution-style manner, he killed Anna too, with blows to her head and neck. Evidence suggests she may have been forced to kneel by the bathtub, where she saw her brother's body. The defensive wounds on her arms indicated she fought to live, but once again, Zakrzewski showed no mercy. After killing both of his children, Zakrzewski went back to Sylvia's body, dragging it into the bathroom and delivering final blows with the machete. He wasn't sure if she was fully dead, so he kept attacking her until he was certain. There's something chilling about Zakrzewski's account of the events. He claimed that he wanted the deaths to be quick and painless, but his actions revealed the opposite. The ruthlessness in his demeanor is hard to ignore. Zakrzewski had mentally justified his actions, convinced that he was protecting his family from the emotional pain of divorce. But this wasn't just a man in emotional distress. It was the act of a man exerting control over a situation he couldn't bear to lose. The machete, crowbar, and rope he used were not just tools of murder. They were symbols of his desire to dominate and destroy everything in his path. After the brutal murders of his wife and children, Edward Zakrzewski went on the run. He fled Florida and eventually ended up in Hawaii, where he assumed a new identity under the name Michael Green. For months, he lived with a family who ran a religious commune, unaware of his criminal past. However, his life would take a dramatic turn when his face appeared on the popular TV show Unsolved Mysteries. Recognizing the man they had been housing, the family confronted Zakrzewski, but before they could take further action, he turned himself into the authorities. Zakrzewski's capture marked the beginning of the legal proceedings that would follow. In October 1994, he was brought back to Florida to face the charges for the cold-blooded murder of his wife and children. Over the next few months, his trial began, and in March 1996, Zakrzewski pled guilty to all 3 counts of first-degree murder. Despite his guilty plea, Zakrzewski's defense team attempted to claim mental and emotional distress as mitigating factors. They argued that his actions were driven by anger and feelings of betrayal, specifically due to Sylvia's desire for a divorce. However, the jury found these claims insufficient to absolve him of the heinous nature of the crime. During the penalty phase of his trial, Zakrzewski's defense tried to show that he had been under the influence of extreme emotional disturbance at the time of the murders, citing his perception of Sylvia's infidelity and her decision to leave. But the prosecution highlighted the premeditation and the brutality of the killings, especially since Zakrzewski had meticulously planned the murders, purchasing the machete and preparing the crime scene before his family even arrived home. The jury, after considering all evidence, recommended the death penalty for the murders of Sylvia and Edward Jr., while recommending life imprisonment for the murder of Anna. However, in a shocking turn, the judge overruled the jury's recommendation for Anna and imposed death sentences for all 3 murders, citing the extreme cruelty and premeditation involved in the killings. Zakrzewski's defense team filed numerous appeals in the following years, trying to argue that the death penalty was too severe for the crime, but the Florida Supreme Court upheld the death sentence. By 2016, Zakrzewski had exhausted all his appeals, and his fate was sealed. His execution date was set for July 31st, 2025, with the Florida governor signing the death warrant. Despite his time in prison and various efforts to challenge the sentence, Zakrzewski remained adamant about his actions being justified in his mind. Edward J. Zakrzewski was pronounced dead at 6:12 p.m. Eastern Time, Thursday, July 31st, 2025, marking the end of a lengthy and controversial legal battle. His final words, delivered coldly, were chilling in their indifference. "I want to thank the good people of the Sunshine State for killing me in the most cold and calculated, clean, humane, and efficient way possible. I have no complaints whatsoever." A stark contrast to the violence of his crimes, Zakrzewski's final moments reflected a man who showed no remorse. In a curious twist, he quoted the poem, "Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening," by Robert Frost, stopping abruptly halfway through the lines, as if lost in his own thoughts, perhaps reflecting on the cold, final nature of his own death. For the last meal, Zakrzewski's asked for fried pork chops, fried onions, potatoes, bacon, toast, root beer, ice cream, pie, and coffee. The execution process began at 6:04 p.m., and within seconds, his breathing slowed significantly after a few labored gasps. It took less than 10 minutes for Zakrzewski to succumb to the nitrogen gas, his body twitching briefly before he was pronounced dead at 6:12 p.m. His last breath marked the conclusion of decades of legal battles and the final chapter of a brutal crime. 13 witnesses were present, including members of the media, law enforcement, and Department of Corrections officials. Not a single one spoke after the execution, leaving the scene eerily silent. A small group of protesters remained outside the prison, their voices drowned by the silence within as the media were escorted away. Edward J. Zakrzewski's crime left a permanent scar on his family and community, but even his execution cannot undo the pain. While justice may be served, no punishment can ever restore the lives lost or heal the wounds caused. Let us remember the victims, the lives lost in a senseless act of violence, and reflect on the lessons learned from such a horrifying crime. Thank you for watching. Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Justice may prevail, but the pain of loss is never truly gone.